I'm Georgia and this is the Sound of Georgia. We're still going with my Sound of Fictionalisation series. So last week we talked about Maria, and today we're going to be talking about Captain von Trapp and the various ways he's portrayed in all of the adaptations of the Von Trapp story. So, like last week, we're going to start with some backstory. Giedroyć von Trapp was born on the 4th of April 1880 in what is now Croatia. This was obviously back when Austria was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and when they had a coastline. He's a sea captain, remember? It took me a while to work out how I was going to talk about him, or more accurately, how I was going to refer to him. You might have noticed in my last video that I flipped a lot between calling him Georg and calling him the Captain. In my brain, when I think about him, it's Georg. But for the most part in my videos I like to try and stick with the Captain, because I know not everybody is as deep down the fanfiction rabbit hole as I am. Captain wasn't the only title he held. He had the title of Baron, along with the title of Ritter, which is the German language equivalent for knight. But Captain is the most well-known and the most simple. It's also the title Maria uses in her memoir to refer to him until they got married. So, with all that said, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to call him the Captain. In 1911 he married Agatha Whitehead, whom he had met a couple years earlier at the launch of the submarine U-5, and whose grandfather had invented the torpedo. I am not making that up. A submarine commander married a descendant of the inventor of the torpedo, and people say his marriage to the singing nun was the weird one. Between 1911 and 1921, the Captain and Agatha had their now famous 7 children, all of whom are sadly deceased. Maria's 3 children are still alive, but the original 7 are no longer with us. The eldest was Rupert, born in 1911. Then there was Agatha in 1913, Maria in 1914, Werner in 1915, Hedwig in 1917, Joanna in 1919, and Martina in 1921. And right in the middle of all that happening, obviously, was World War I. The Captain served as a submarine commander and was eventually awarded the Maria Theresian Medal for his service. In 1922, after his wife died, the Captain and the children moved to Salzburg, which is where our story, and by that I mean the adaptations, begins. Unlike Maria, who is rather similar across the board, all things considered, depending on the adaptation, the Captain is very different. Maria's initial thoughts on him, and particularly how wrong she was, are very much the same, though. In her memoir she admits that he was nothing like she thought he would be. Sound of Music has her quip that he doesn't look like a sea captain, and in the anime there's this little imagination sequence of a pirate in a submarine. However, it's not entirely known if he was actually home the day she first arrived. In every adaptation he's there when she arrives, and that's exactly what she says in her first memoir. But in her final one, she says he wasn't. Definitely seemed to be a lot of contradictions between these 2 memoirs. But unlike the last video, where I think we could put her 2 different recounts of marrying him down to hindsight, we can't really do that with this situation. This contradiction definitely isn't down to how she feels about the situation. I don't know what it is. The stage version of Sound of Music has a scene with him at the villa before Maria arrives for the first time, but that's the only adaptation where we're not introduced to him at the same time as Maria. Sound of Music is also the only one where he doesn't introduce the children personally. He really did have a whistle and they really did all have signals, and in every single one he calls them down in that fashion, but Sound of Music is the only one that turns the whistles into more than that. In the German film and the anime, what happens is what happened in real life. He called them all down and then introduced Maria to them personally, rather than standing on the sidelines and blowing the whistle and making them do it themselves. In the German film it's all 7 of them, while in the anime it follows what Maria's original memoir says, and it's only 6 of them, and then he introduces her to little Maria separately. Now, whether or not he was there the day she first arrived, he did disappear quite a lot. You've all heard a billion times before how he wasn't the cold-hearted tyrant that Sound of Music made him. Not that I would use the word tyrant to describe Rodgers and Hammerstein's version of him anyway, but yes, no, he was much colder there than he was in real life, but he still spent a lot of time away from home. But no matter the version, he's always shut music out of his life. So while he's gone, Maria and the children have time to bond and talk about music. According to a memoir, he arrived home one day and interrupted their sing-along. But he was pleasantly surprised and asked them to continue, and eventually started to play the violin, which Maria had been told he'd given up years ago. We all know he was furious when he arrived home in Sound of Music, and the Trapp family actually follows this as well. It's only after they start singing that he has a change of heart. The anime is a bit more complex, but then again, it's a TV series, so we've got a lot more time to unpack things. Maria's trying to get little Maria to learn the violin, which was a moment that did actually happen. When the captain finds out, he's angry and upset about Maria bringing up memories of his wife, and they have their argument. But it's closer to the civil one in the German film rather than what we get in Sound of Music. And then when little Maria asks him herself, he starts playing, and we all know that means his answer is yes. I said it last week, but I'm honestly not sure when they're meant to fall in love in the anime. But it's very clear when we have the Christmas scene that he's got some feelings for her. It's also the case in the Christmas scene in the German film. The Sound of Music is the unfinished Ländler, which, no matter whether it's the stage or the screen version, is not the real Austrian dance. The real dance wouldn't be to the music of the Lonely Goatherd in 3/4 time. Yeah, watch the scene again. Like the anime, it's a little hard to pinpoint exactly when he fell in love with her in real life, because the sources we've got are from Maria directly, and, well, she wouldn't know. I think we can more or less guess when she fell in love with him. In reality, she talks about it in her final memoir, and it's wonderful, and I want to talk about it one day, and I also want to try and incorporate it into a fanfiction I write, but it's not a moment that really lines up with any of the adaptations, and because it's all her perspective, we don't know when that moment happened for him. What we do know is how he felt about his family singing in public. In the Trapp family, his disdain for it is very evident. He won't sing with them, and he ends up leaving before the performance is over, which is actually how it went down in reality. The German film is the only adaptation that follows through with that. Back then, no matter how bleak things got, aristocrats did not sing. Except when they did. He doesn't do it at the very beginning in the anime, but then the president requests it and the two youngest children drag him on stage. So he does. It goes a bit further, and from then on, he agrees only if there's no profit involved. On to Sound of Music. The singing group as a whole is treated very, very differently by Rodgers and Hammerstein. In reality, it was their livelihood. After they went bankrupt, this is how they made their livelihood, and it was what they originally became famous for. In Sound of Music, it's really just a plot device. It's just a cover so that they have a way to escape. And yeah, you could argue that's the only reason he gives in, but then he has his solo performance of Edelweiss. So, probably not. That pretty much proves he feels different to this than he did in reality, and it lines up more with the anime than the German film. Is it ironic, or is it beautifully coincidental that Edelweiss was the last song Hammerstein wrote? So let's talk about the escape. Captain von Trapp was very famously anti-Nazi, and that is present in all the adaptations. It has to be. It was such a crucial part of who he was as a person. So when it comes to the escape, he's got more of a hand in it than just singing about Austria's national flower in a concert hall. Most of the time. In reality, in the months that followed after the Anschluss, there was about 6 of them between then and when they escaped. He told Maria not to go into town unless she really needed to, and he made pretty unrelatable small talk at meals because he didn't know who he could trust. The Gestapo arrived one day and asked why he wasn't hanging the swastika, and he said it was too expensive. When they gave him a flag right there and then, he said he didn't like the colour. A little while later, he received a letter asking him to take command of a new submarine, and the designs of the ship almost sent him into fanboy mode, but he couldn't bring himself to work for the Nazis. The eldest son, Rupert, was a doctor, and he was offered a position at a suddenly very short-staffed hospital, and then they were asked to sing on the radio for Hitler's birthday. They wouldn't do either of these things, so they knew they had to get out. In the Trapp family, as soon as they hear the announcement about the Anschluss, the butler appears and announces he's been in league with the Nazis the whole time, which is pretty much exactly the same way it went in real life. But we'll talk about him later. Then a minute after that, a Nazi official arrives and asks him to fly the flag. Captain punches him and tells him to get out, but he basically tells him that they're the ones that need to get out, which is exactly what Maria says. She points out that he'll be arrested if they don't, and so he eventually relents to her idea of escaping to America, and they head off the next day under the guise of a walk in the mountains. I'm about to be pretty much repeating myself from last episode, because I talked about how his contributions to the escape in Sound of Music are completely dependent on which version you're looking at. The same thing happens, but whether it's Maria or the captain doing it depends on whether we're looking at the stage or the screen. At this point in the musical, we have one of the most uncomfortable scenes ever. He gets the telegram that orders him to his new command, and he says that they need to get out. But he seems a little up in the air about it. Honestly, Ray actually suggests he should go on his own, but he won't do that. Then Herr Zeller arrives and he pretty much fumbles his way through that entire conversation.
Having had no answer to our telegram, the High Command has sent me in person.
That's very flattering, sir, but I've had no time.
I'm here to present you with your commission.
I'm deeply conscious of the honour.
And your orders are to report immediately to the naval base at Bremerhaven.
With Maria saving the day at the end by mentioning the festival. When they're hiding in the abbey after the festival, he's comforting the children and bemoaning his fate.
I've always thought of these mountains as my friends, standing there protecting us. Now it seems they've become my enemy.
Then Maria jumps in with her inaccurate geography, saying that they'll be fine. If they work together, they can get over the mountains to Switzerland. The movie changes all of this, and as far as his character goes, it's so much better. By the time 16 going on 17 reprise has ended and he's told Maria about the command, it's very clear that he knows exactly what they're going to do. He doesn't need to think about it. They have to go. And then when they bump into Zeller as they're leaving, he's the one that stalls for them and brings up the festival. And then in the abbey, when Rolf stays behind to catch them, he goes and confronts him, which ends up with Rolf ratting them out. But only in the movie. In the musical, Rolf lets them go. Wuss. And this time he's the one that insists they'll all be fine if they work together as they go over the mountains. The dialogue is pretty much identical, but switched characters. The anime follows the memoir in that there's a time gap between when the Anschluss happens and when they need to escape. The children are all talking about the new changes that are happening in school. At one point he snaps and says that he would rather drink wine with cut glass than agree with the Nazis, which is something he actually did say in real life. The butler's allegiances are revealed a couple episodes after the first announcement in the inspiringly titled episode, Hans's Secret. The captain and Maria arrive home to find the swastika hanging outside, and when Hans spills the beans, the captain says he needs to get out. But then Hans says that the family will be doomed if he does that, and he gets to stay. Back to the captain, he once again receives the request to command the submarine, and that they should all sing for Hitler's birthday. Knowing he can't refuse them both, he poses a question to the family, which is almost identical to what he posed in reality. Give up their possessions or give up their dignity. In the anime, it turns into a full speech about being true to yourself and ending with the fact that they need to leave. And in the next episode, all that is set in motion. And if you want to hear more about that, just check the video about Maria. Overall, with the captain, the essence of him is always there. His portrayals vary quite a lot, and in some versions, Sound of Music, contain things that are completely fabricated. But the most important part about him, his patriotism, is always there. But he definitely receives a lot more fictionalization than Maria or the children. We'll be talking about them next week, but for now, that's all I've got for today. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you guys are all staying safe, feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my video next week. So long, farewell!